Hey, welcome back to Garbro's Field Desk. I have for you Chapter 12 of the Book 1 Mk.II redo. Like, subscribe, comment down below. Let's go. Chapter 12. Off we go again. Yule blinked away the raindrops that ran down the bill of his patrol cap and gave a soft snort of annoyance. It seemed that no matter when or where he was, it always wanted to rain when he was laying in wait during an ambush. Yule looked down the line of riflemen that were hiding along the same natural berm that he was hunkered down behind, and couldn't help but crack a wry grin. What a bunch of Lord of the Rings bullshit this is. All along the berm were strewn valley elves, dwarves, brim-touched Oni, adorned, and his own Veil Riders, a cluster-fucked mishmash of gear, uniforms, weapons, and armor. Yule was direly behind schedule for his operations and really wanted to get out into the field sooner, but even he knew he had a manpower problem. When the call for volunteers went out over the mail network, able-bodied men and women from the cities surrounding Norris came in droves to be drilled into competent, if green, Veil Rider infantry auxiliaries. Yule was grateful for the Confederation that these people had set up hundreds of years before, which allowed him to dip his hand into all the cultures at once. Not only was the outpost, now named Valhalla Hill, due to the carvings and scroll works the dwarves and Brimtouch put up about the place, a huge fob of its own accord, but it stretched all the way down to the bottom of the hill, resembling some kind of weird postmodern fortification town. Except where buildings and markets should have been, there were instead pillboxes, kill holes, and workshops where weapons were maintained or even created. Yule had been quite taken aback by how many of the Veil folk showed up to volunteer, and took to having them drilled in the arts of riflery and basic platoon-based tactics. He even took the training of the auxiliary NCOs into his own hands, and held many a late-night classroom session where he put the amulet to good use. Yethis was also helping him get more of his Tonka down pat, drilling him on basic phrases as he drilled the folk around him. Yule looked over to Yethis, who was grumbling irritably as rain dripped in fat drops down her patrol cap and hair braid. Yethis had been christened the top shirt of the Healer Corps, with Gruesome serving as the overall command sergeant major. He had been busy instructing them on basic combat casualty care, how to pack their medical kits, as well as headlining more advanced forms of combat medicines. Yethis herself preened for days after she was given the rank, and continuously made sure the other healers called her First Sergeant. Thankfully, the Oni were skilled weavers, and were able to crank out the majority of the U.S. Army ranks that were required to sew onto uniforms for designations. The Oni were taking up a lot of the textile workload, along with the Brim-touched, and now professional-looking uniforms could be found on this side of the Veil, designed by the well-loved Armstrongs. They were mirrored after the U.S. Army standard battle dress uniform of the 1980s, but in a solid moss-type color that was as close as they could get to olive drab green. In addition to these uniforms, there were also fresh unit patches being made for the auxiliaries, now sharing the same unit brotherhood of the Veil Riders. The only ones who did not partake in the unit patch were the 601st, but everyone was more than happy to let them make their own decisions. The 601st themselves took a keen interest in some of the volunteers that came in from the surrounding countryside, and picked out a trooper here or there that showed promise in the more ungentlemanly aspects of combat. They themselves had recreations of their own unit patch, and now consisted of a small platoon of troopers that operated on their own accord. Yule had no problems with this, and just asked Prusik to make sure to watch out for the Veil folk. Prusik had no arguments with this request, and kept Yule up to date on their comings and goings from Valhalla Hill. The 601st Platoon was actually why they were all out hugging this berm, watching the opening from a forest while the rain pelted down from on high. The 601st's recon outings allowed them to stumble upon a large company of infantry moving north from Sanrion, and spent some length of time harassing them during the night. Prusik went as far as to take out an entire squad in their sleep and left the bleeding bodies in their bedrolls to be discovered the morning after. The 601st did not have the manpower to take out the entire company, as they were traveling with 2 LGS Phoenix and an M1117 ASV. When the male brush-feathered landed down near the command bunker and told Yule the news, he scrabbled together an ambush force and immediately set out, his aim to take the vehicles whole and undamaged so they could make use of them themselves. It was those vehicles they waited on, soggy and laying in the grass as patiently as they could. The dwarven machine gunners chuckled and drank from their flasks, manning a Veil Rider M240 Bravo, while the Brim Touch and Oni took the time to perfect the camo netting they had draped around their horns. The first dragoons all lounged in the spitting rain, a few having dragged tarpaulins over themselves to try and stay as dry as they could manage. Yethis saddled up next to Yule, shaking the water from her rifle as she did, and grumped softly.
"I'm cold,"
she murmured, and Yule felt her snuggle up next to him. "Hi, Cold, I'm Yule," Yule said back with a grin, and she punched him in the shoulder with the wet splack of rain-sodden clothing. Yule looked down at her rifle as he rubbed his shoulder, and couldn't help but marvel at it. The dwarves had done a remarkable job copying the Mk.II, but instead of plastic, it had stained hardwood furniture and runic embellishments all down the frame. They even had runes inscribed on the bolt and bolt release, something to do with making sure they never failed or exploded. The exploding bit made him curious, and he pondered about just what happened during the testing phase, but shook it from his head. From the woodwork that went into the rifle, he was almost tempted to trade his Daewoo for one of theirs. There was something wholesome about the aesthetic they had accomplished with blending the dark dwarven steel and almost red-blonde lumber they had used for the handguard and buttstock. It harkened back to a more classical time in human history, when steel was steel and wood was wood, and how those two things made up the body of a real rifle. Down the line, he saw a lot of the same, with the dwarves of the ambush team instead going for the runic fowls, which also had the same runes inscribed on them and wooden furniture to boot. A few yards away was Domino and Chicks, who had somehow convinced the Oni to craft them a rustic version of a boonie hat, which currently poured rainwater onto their rifles and shoulders. Their eyes were pressed hard to their scopes as they peered through the gloom and murk of the rain, watching the road with killer intent in their eyes. Chicks and Domino were both ever keen to be in on the ambushes, even getting into physical altercations with other dragoons on who would get to go. It got to the point that the two would threaten other dragoons if they were too late to the meeting or sign-up call, and one dragoon had found their rifle missing their bolt, having been taken hostage until their position was given up. Hours passed as the rain continued to pour down, and by that time the dwarven machine gunners were on their 5th flask, both of them chuckling to each other and muttering in Anderbala, while the other dwarven riflemen were busily rubbing oils and lubricants into their rifles to make sure the rain was kept at bay. Yule craned his head up and saw a Brim Touch was making a small stick house with the Valley Elf, and rolled his eyes. If this was just an elaborate trap to get the first dragoons and their auxiliaries soaked in the rain, they should be happy with the results. Yule was beginning to get taxed when it came to his patience, as he was chilled to the bone at this point, and Yethis had cuddled up so close to him that she was probably soaking up any warmth his body managed to produce. Lights. Domino and Chicks said at the same time, and Yule saw their barrels slowly tracking something in the distance. Shrugging off Yethis, Yule crawled up the berm a little and poked his eyes over the top of it. Way out into the forest trail, he could see something akin to faintly glowing orbs popping up and disappearing through the trunks of the trees. Yule shuffled back down and hissed at both sides of the ambush line. "Quit fucking about. Time to do the war thing." He had forgotten the word for combat in Tunka, and instead interjected what he knew. Yethis gave a snort of laughter and reminded you of the proper word he was looking for, in which he then shouted, "Combat time!" in a hushed but loud tone. The last thing he wanted was for this voice to carry, but the rain coming down was so loud it was doubtful one could hear an Abrams rumble by while blasting dance music from speakers. The Veil Riders and their auxiliaries wiggle-wormed their way up the berm, and barrels now drew down on the road that exited out of the woods. From where they were set up, the column would have to exit out of the forest and then turn right, which would stretch them out all along the main firing lane the ambush was going to make use of. This in turn only left the column a few decisions. They could hunker down and fight back in the open, run back into the woods and abandon the road, try and push through the ambush down the road, or try and back up their entire column. Yule expected them to flee through the forest, which only provided meager cover for the infantry, and they would have to leave their vehicles behind, the main mission objective for Yule. With the majority of the column on foot, that meant they were mostly unarmored, unlike the first ambush in which they had plenty of trucks and disembarked to avoid getting killed in them. These chosen children troopers were probably extremely green as his men for that matter, and what that meant to Yule was that these cats would drop and look for cover as soon as the first belt of machine gun fire was ripped through. This would leave his line plenty of time to cut them down and pick them apart as they worked through their avenues of retreat. Yule got deja vu from his first ambush when he heard the rumble of engines in the distance, and he quickly scrambled up and down the line to double-check the orders he had given to the auxiliaries and dragoons. In lead of the column was the ASV, the turret facing the front, while 3 whole platoons just strolled behind it. Behind those platoons was a Finnick, another 3 platoons, the last Finnick which towed a wagon of some sorts, and 2 more platoons behind that. All of the turrets were facing forwards, and they were moseying along at a crawl through the rain. The last Finnick didn't even bother to point its turret to the rear, and Yule snorted as he passed Domino. Fucking amateurs. Domino smiled brightly, his teeth shining despite the gloom of the evening.
Just makes you want to teach them something new.
I'll teach them how to die like the dumb knife-ear bastards they are.
Chick sneered. She heard Yethis make a scoff noise in which she took her eye from her scope and looked at the elf.
Not your kind of ears, Yethis. You have long, cute ears. They have cunt ears.
Yethis furrowed her eyebrows at Chicks and stuck her tongue out of her, which Chicks answered with her own tongue and then went back to her scope. The column was now beginning to turn out from the forest and follow the road around the bend. Yule heard troopers down the line double-checking their weapons and slapped the wet berm with his palm to get their attention. "On me!" Yule hissed, and checked his own bolt to make sure there was brass peeking out to greet him in the receiver. He heard his order repeated down the line, and a lot of eyes were resting on him. "Also, don't shoot the fucking tires. Those damn things are gold," Yule reminded them, and he now wondered if this realm even had rubber trees to begin with. "Ready, girl?" Yule asked Yethis and slapped her on the back to get her attention. Yethis gave a shuddered
"Yes"
in return and flicked her rifle's safety around to fire. Rain tinked on the barrels that protruded out from the berm, and Yule was getting frustrated. At this distance, with the weight of the rain, the column was hard to see, and even the keen-eyed elves were having trouble making out the figures through the pelting sheets. The longer they waited, the further the column would get down the road, and the entire ambush would be spoiled, requiring Yule to retreat all of his squads and push in parallel to try and catch them again down the road. Just as Yule was about to wave off the ambush and tell them to retreat, there was suddenly a deafening silence. He looked around from where he was laying, and now water only dripped down here and there from the trees, instead of pouring down from the sky. He crawled up and peeked over the berm to see the column was doing the same, and had actually halted just inside their ambush corridor. He could hear them laughing from where he was, and speaking in their southern dialect known as Low Fey.
Hey, look! It's like the grind just turned off.
One chosen child trooper cried out, and he laughed along with his platoon mates as they all shook their rifles clear of rainwater. From the hatches of the vehicles, the drivers' heads popped out, having risen their seats up so they could drive and be able to get some fresh air. It was the first time Yule had seen their uniforms clearly, and they were wearing some kind of dark green digital camouflage that reminded him of Tiger Stripe a bit. Yule then heard the scritch of a Velcro pocket being undone, and his face soured. He hated Velcro. There was nothing less stealthy than fucking Velcro. Yule pointed at Domino and whispered, "Confirm targets." Domino panned left and right quickly, grimacing hard and focused before whispering back.
They're all elves from what I can tell. They ain't none of ours. And they have UN markings. Oh, look, one actually says unseat.
Yule hadn't waited for him to finish, having high-crawled all the way up to the top of the berm after Domino had said, "None of ours." He pressed his free hand on top of his handguard and rotated his selector switch to its third setting. Fuckett had asked why Yule's K2 didn't have an auto-sear like the other rifles, and had been more than happy to put one in himself if Yule wanted one. The crisp click of the trigger broke the air as Yule slammed the mechanism back, and his rifle spewed Dwarven 5.56 in full auto down at the platoon that was behind the second Finnick. Brass sang through the air as the bullets cracked out of the barrel, slamming into the bodies of the chosen children troopers and showering mud everywhere as they impacted the road. Many of them were still looking up at the sky as burning lead shot ripped through their flesh and tore apart their organs. The magazine went quickly, and Yule dropped the empty vessel with the depression of his mag release, clicking a fresh one into the mag well with smooth and professional precision. Domino and Chicks fired their first salvo right after Yule opened up, and Yule saw two of the drivers flop over in their seats, the rounds having spliced right through the sides of their heads and showered the hatch next to them in brain matter. A split second after the two snipers, the Veil Riders opened up and rained hell down on the convoy. The auxiliaries had been caught off guard, but snapped back to reality and joined in on the gunfire. The dwarves bellowed out war cries as they fired their weapons, the machine gunners laughing as their M240 Bravos roared with the other rifles around it. Yethis was frozen, looking from Yule to the elves dying in droves below. Yule looked over at her as he pressed the bolt release of his rifle, slamming it home and startling water off the rifle as it vibrated its frame. "Fire your weapon, Yethis," he barked, and Yethis looked to him wide-eyed. Yule reached over and hefted Yethis up towards him by her combat harness, making her squeak in shock as she was dragged a few feet up and over towards Yule. From this vantage point, she could better see what was happening down below. Water and mud leapt and danced off the ground as rounds impacted, and elves were falling all over the road. True to Yule's predictions, they had no idea how to react to the sudden ambush, and had dropped right onto the ground, firing wildly at the flashes in the distance. Dirt and mud spacked and thwacked here and there along the ambush line, but their fire never ceased onto the damned souls below. "Your weapon, Yethis! Use it! Fire your weapon, just like I showed you!" Yule bellowed, bringing his rifle to his shoulder and firing in short bursts. Yethis looked at Yule, then shrugged down behind her rifle, looking down the sights. Unlike Yule's eyes, Yethis had a heightened sense like most elves did, allowing her to focus deeper and see farther to a more accurate degree. She trained her sights along the column, the black forward sight post swaying back and forth. Beside her, Yule kept firing in bursts, and she could see his tracers trailing along the bodies. She watched the elves below dive and shrink away from the rounds, as well as the ones who were too slow screech in shock as the rounds punched through them. She saw the dwarves trail one elf who was running. The M240 Bravo stream of bullets whipping water into the air behind them as they sprinted their way to the safety of a vehicle's rear hatch. The trail quickly caught up, and Yethis watched as her body was ripped apart by the heavy 7.62 ammunition. The elf screamed as the first few rounds tore through her leg and arm, but the scream was cut short as the follow-up rounds turned her face and head to mush. Yethis could hear her blood thundering in her ears along with the subtle ringing of the gunfire, and she trailed her sights to a small group of chosen children who were trying to deploy a small field mortar. She had seen what the dwarves could do with theirs after they launched around at a small farm animal and wanted nothing like that coming her way. Yethis squeezed the trigger in short bursts and cut them all down before she was even halfway through her magazine. The first elf took one round to the throat and went down in the mud, rolling and kicking his boots frantically as his hands clutched at the waterfall of blood that poured out from his neck. The second elf took all of hers in the chest, slumping forward and falling over the mortar tube, smashing it into the road. The third elf turned to run, and Yethis shot him in the back twice, watching him land heavily onto the road, splashing down in the water to move no more. When she looked over to Yule, he was grinning at her, having watched her the entire time she was shooting. She swallowed hard, her ears twitching, before she grimaced and went back to her sights. Yule gave her a pat on the shoulder, yelling, "Keep it up, Slayer," before dropping his second mag to load in a fresh one. After locking it into place, he ran down the length of the ambush line, watching how all the troopers were operating. The dwarves were all having a real time of it, roaring and shouting curses as they fired. The Oni and Valley Elves all had a kind of business face on, quiet and working away at the triggers of their rifles as if they were fussing with just another tool in the workshop. The Brim touched, they all seemed to be grinning in a malicious way, and Yule watched them slowly pick off runners who tried to make a break through the forest. That's rough, Yule thought, before checking on his dragoons, who were all spending more time coaching the auxiliaries around them than actually firing. He popped his head back up and made a painful face at what he saw down below. All of the vehicles were not moving. Not even the turrets had spun their direction, and he saw that all the hatches were open, probably because the crews decided fuck this and bailed. The road itself was littered with the dead and the dying, who wailed or clutched at their wounds. Yule ran his eyes up and down the road and saw that anything that wasn't dying in the mud had made a break for survival, and they no longer had incoming fire. He waved his hand back and forth to signal them all to stop firing. "Cease fire! Cease fire! Give me a team on Overwatch. Everyone else, get down there and secure those vehicles. If there's anything left alive, keep it alive. We need prisoners for answers." Casualties were light for the Veil Riders in this ambush, only suffering minor grazes and gunshot wounds due to their slight elevation in natural cover of the berm. One Veil Rider had a graze on the side of his head and was rattled pretty hard by the concussion of it, but seemed to be doing fine in the hands of the healer corps. The dwarven machine gunners and the sharpshooters were set up high and hard on the berm while everyone else walked down towards the road, weapons held at the high ready as they approached. The scene below was just another slaughter, and Yule clicked his tongue distastefully. None of the green chosen children's soldiers had even tried to defuse the ambush, and many had died where they laid or stood. He saw that most of them had smoke grenades and quietly pondered if they had been trained at all besides basic soldiering. Yule spun around as he heard fresh gunfire bursting behind him and brought up his rifle in time to empty a whole magazine into a chosen child trooper that had been playing possum on the road. Before Yule ended him right then and there, the trooper had rolled over and gunned down 2 Veil Riders and 3 Valley Elf auxiliaries with his M4 carbine. Only one of the Valley Elves was alive, and Yethis sprinted over towards them, her boots splashing on the soaked ground. Everyone else on the approach went down to a knee and had their rifles up, scanning for targets just as Yule had taught them. And Yule ran over to the small huddle of bodies that lay around the now dead chosen child trooper. The faces of his fellow humans were frozen in surprise, the bullets from the burst fire rifle having killed them instantly purely by luck of the draw, impacting their spinal columns or punching right through their hearts. He had been with these Veil Riders since the beginning. Mark was a steel worker from Ohio, and Beth a coffee barista that was just tired of doing the same thing every day, both of them looking to get in on a grand adventure. Yule reached down and closed their wide, shocked eyes, then ripped the patches off of their uniforms, tucking them inside one of his pockets. Yethis coaxed the one wounded elf back into the solidarity of this realm, and Yule turned to look at the road. He saw that many bodies were squirming or laying very still while their chests still moved, and he frowned harshly. He had intended, after the cock-up with Britta, to take as many prisoners as he could manage and be the good guy for once. But now that idea flapped away from the window, tweeting out a bloodlusting tune. Yule turned to the Veil Riders behind him, who were trying their best not to look at their fallen comrades. He held up 5 fingers and spoke in a steely manner. "I want 5 alive. Kill the rest." Without a word more, the Veil Riders stood and began moving through the road, killing anything that was suspect and only taking what was alive and raising their hands when they approached. Yule kept count of every rifle burst as he stared down at his dead troopers, who were being made ready to be hauled back to Valhalla Hill for burial. 2 more humans to be laid down in foreign ground. Our numbers grow thinner, Yule thought as he kept counting the rifle reports, and looked over to see Yethis and another auxiliary help the wounded elf limp back towards the berm. The elf had taken most of his rounds to the legs and stomach, and while healed, the pain would still render his limbs difficult to use. Yule heard no more gunshots and murmured aloud, 18 possible prisoners. A pity. Truly a pity. He turned and saw the Onian dwarves dragging along what looked like 5 mud-logged elves, 3 of which bore the red crosses of medics. The auxiliaries tossed the elves towards Yule, and they splashed down hard into the mud and water puddles of the road. Yule slowly squatted down on his heels and used the barrel of his Mk.II to lift the chin of a female who glared up at him with ivory white eyes. He then looked over to a male next to her and saw that he instead had violet eyes, the elf heaving heavily while clutching his chest. Unlike their Valley Elf cousins, these southern elves had higher, more proper pointed ears that reminded him of high elves in fantasy games back home, and fine bone faces that harkened back to space elves that were known in a popular sci-fi war game on Earth. He looked back over at the female and saw that her hat had fallen off some time during the ambush, and her copper hair was full of blood and mud which streaked down her face in ugly swaths. Their eyes did indeed share the same soft almond shape of the Valley Elves, but theirs were so much more sinister in their complexion, angled in a way that gave off constant aggression. Curious, Yule murmured, then moved his barrel away from her chin with a ring of metal on skin. Her head bobbed and she exhaled sharply, having been expecting a bullet to fly out from the barrel and end her. Bag their heads and toss them in the M1117. Let's get our fallen out of this pit, Yule said, gesturing to the muddy elves and then pointing to the security vehicle. With the southern elf prisoners bagged like falcons and tossed into the engine stowage compartment of the M1117 ASV, the rest of the snatch and grab went with ease, since most of the German Veil Riders knew how to drive Phoenix, and Yule was an old lover of the ASV himself. As he hauled out the dead driver and threw the body away from the wheels, he made a tisk of disgust when he climbed into the seat. Yule saw that half of the toggle switches were turned off in the passenger's haste to get out of the vehicle. He popped his head up and saw that the TC must have slipped on his driver's brain matter, as there was a smear of red across the top deck of the ASV and a large mud splat down by the left front tire. Yule heard the Phoenix fire back up behind him, driving off towards the ambush line, and he quickly toggled on the fuel pump and other critical functions on the switchboard in order to get the girl back up and running. Behind him, a Veil Rider was scrambling into the gunner basket and turning on the electronics. "Who's in my fucking truck?" Yule asked, reaching down to ignite the engine and then listening to the Cummins 6C TA8 rumble back to life behind him.
McCormick!
A voice called out, and Yule felt the electronic motors of the turret click on and swing the basket to the left. The next thing he felt was the clap of air 10 feet away from his truck, and the ring of shrapnel bouncing off of the ASV's armor. Yule popped his head up and out of the driver hatch when the mud stopped splacking through the opening. A mortar round had fallen down and exploded almost on top of the deck plate, and that was a mighty big hole staring back at him from the mud. The dead driver was also now all over the top of the armor deck. He heard another dull explosion behind him, and a great cascade of debris and mud was flung into the air. It was by luck that the majority of the ambush party had already moved away back towards the berm, and he saw that a lot of the Veil Riders had their heads down in the grass and were looking around wildly. Yule leaned over the side of his driver hatch and bellowed out to those laying in the grass. "Clear out of the open! Get back to the berm and fall back to the horses! Get the fuck out of here! You lot!" Yule pointed to a small huddle of Veil Rider auxiliaries that were using the ASV for cover. "Get in this fucking truck or die!" Yule pressed the transmission into automatic and made sure the 4-wheel drive selector was initiated. Seeing that it was, in fact, in 2-wheel drive, Yule slapped it to 4-wheel drive, eliciting a hiss from the rumbling engine. It was around the time that the Veil Rider auxiliaries closed the open side hatch that another round impacted right next to where they were huddled, and the concussion of the impact rocked the armored vehicle from side to side. With little ceremony, Yule cranked the wheel one-handed towards the berm and punched the accelerator, lurching them into motion as he wrangled the blood-covered headset around his face. Some of the previous driver's brains got on his lips, and he had to rapidly spit it off while driving. As he wheeled around, he saw that all the other Veil Riders had already hoofed it over the berm and into the brush to get to the horses. Mortar fire continued to rain down around them, and Yule grimaced, the auxiliaries screaming in panic as the vehicle was rocked back and forth. Yule toggled the headset with his free hand, rolling the wheel to straight and putting the ASV back down in a lower gear to mount the climb over the berm. "McCormick, do you see anything in the woods to our rear?" He swerved to avoid a fresh mortar crater, which caused more Veil-flavored screaming to erupt as they were thrown across the very tight passage corridor. The elves shoved into the engine stowage were screaming as well, but it was blessedly muffled by the double door. The gunner basket whirred and spun to the rear of the ASV, and Yule heard McCormick yelling at the auxiliaries to keep their hands away from the bottom of the gunner basket.
Negative, Yule. I don't see any spotters.
"Then how the hell are they spotting us?" Yule grunted, the ASV's nose pitching upwards and then down as they came off of the berm. He let off the throttle, switched the transmission back into automatic, and hit the gas hard to catch up to the rest of the Veil Riders. The mortars continued to rain down around them, throwing earth and torn plant matter into the air. There was a hollow bong as a round impacted on the angled plate of the turret, causing the vehicle to vibrate like a bell for a moment.
"All good!"
McCormick called out and swung the basket back around towards the front. A great gout of mud splashed over the window screens of the driver's seat, and when Yule went to turn on the wipers, he found that the switch had been broken off by the panicked boot of the TC on his way out. Fuck, Yule growled as he swung the driver hatch back open and began to raise his seat, just enough to poke his eyes over the lip of the opening. The wind ripped Yule's patrol cap off of his head and tossed it back into the hatch, causing his hair to whip around him wildly and smack him in the eyes. That problem was soon fixed as a fresh deluge of wet earth slapped across the deck of the vehicle and pinned his mud-matted hair to his face. All Yule could do was try and toss his head back and forth to try and remove it. Yule gritted his teeth, spitting out mud that got inside his mouth, and swung the truck right to avoid another huge mortar hole. Ahead of him he saw the running lights of the Phoenix and the dozens of blurs that were the horses, and pressed the pedal to the floor. Finite range, finite range. Yule chanted to himself under the roar of the Cummins engine and the impacts of mortar rounds around the vehicle. He had no idea how the hell the mortar fire was this accurate even over the berm, and was furious that they were able to even get rounds at him so soon after the ambush. What were they using? Drones? They were bracketing him left, right, and center at full speed. Another round exploded on top of the ASV, this time hitting just above the left side hatch. The impact almost tore the entire door away from its hinges, hanging limply off the vehicle's frame as smoke poured into the fighting compartment.
Impact! Doors are kind of fucked up. No serious injuries.
McCormick yelled over the mic, and Yule could hear him yelling something in Tunka. The ASV was rocking hard now as the suspension struggled to keep up with the terrain, but the old birds were made to do this kind of stuff at full speed. Yule didn't breathe easy until the mortar fire became more staggered and finally stopped entirely, leaving him free and clear of any more incoming indirect fire. The huge engine roared and spewed black smoke out from its exhaust as Yule heaved and whirled the wheel to bring the heavy vehicle in line with the tracks of the Phoenix. He spared a moment to duck his head inside and peer into the smoky dim of the inner compartment, seeing auxiliaries sprawled across the deck plating while his gunner had his face pressed hard to the optic mount. The Oni seemed to be having the worst time of it, as the larger female was more or less curled into a ball and trying not to roll across the deck any more than she already had. A fresh gash had split open on her forehead, and a brim touch seemed to have had one of his horns broken off halfway. They were alive, however, despite that door hit from the mortar, and that was enough for Yule. As the terrain leveled out, he made sure the vehicle was in the correct format for it, and used a bullet to crack the wipers on to clear away the mud. He brought the vehicle in formation with the Phoenix, the three vehicles in an offset pattern to keep from splattering the vehicle behind them with mud. The dragoons galloped and whooped beside them as the vehicles roared onward, the low rumble of the mortar fire being left behind on the horizon. The ride back to Valhalla Hill took some time, but the freshly acquired vehicles rolled up the wagon path to the top of the hill with victorious applause. To save the horses, a lot of the dragoons switched off their mounts and instead rode on top of the armored vehicles, waving and blowing kisses to the other Veil Riders as they laughed and cheered at the ambush unit. The horses themselves would show up in a few days and wait outside of the corral. They had been doing this for a few weeks, and it was a handy bit of training to have in case there was no time to remount, or if the dragoons had to scatter their horses due to artillery fire. Yule nodded to Piper, who waved at him from the command bunker, and he rolled the ASV to a stop with a bright hiss of hydraulics. Soft clicking echoed out from the driver's hatch as Yule switched off the engine and the pumps, while the passengers inside unhinged both of the side hatches and piled out into the freedom of fresh air. After ticking down the after-check list and making sure the vehicle was squared away, Yule groaned and crawled his way up and out of the hatch. Forgetting that the thing was covered in still wet mud, blood, and elf bits, his hands slipped as he tried to heave himself up and over, only getting the over instead. Involuntarily, he heaved himself down the front of the windows and tumbled over the guide bars, trailing a loud cacophony of curses and roars of pain. Yule landed with a wet smack on the ground in front of the command bunker, and Piper slowly leaned into view, holding a mugroot cigar in his smiling teeth. "Rough drive, Yule?" "Shut up, you kraut," Yule said through gritted teeth, and groaned as he got up to a knee, mud still sticking to his hair and face. His legs were sore from bouncing around inside the lower driving compartment, and the concussions rocking the chassis had caused him to bang his knees quite a few times on the bolts that were designed to hurt the driver, as all Army vehicles are. Piper laughed heartily, more at Yule's expense than anything else, and helped him to his feet, brushing the mud off his shoulders like a fussy nanny. "Can't take you Americans anywhere, always getting so dirty," Piper mused, and chucked his teeth disapprovingly. "Oh, ha-ha," Yule retorted, slapping at Piper's hands as he laughed at him some more, and dusted off his own pants and shirt, dried mud coming away in flakes and chunks. "Got some chosen children locked away in the engine compartment. Let's get them out of there and into the bunker." Piper raised his eyebrows, then tucked his fingers into his mouth and gave a sharp whistle. McCormick was making his way out of the gunner basket when 5 of the European Veil Riders trotted over and leveled their weapons at the hatch, while Piper undid the latch locks. The top part of the hatch hissed up while the bottom part slowly came down with the hydraulic dampeners, and a silence fell down around the rear team. Yule was prying his muddy hair away from his face when he heard Piper call from the rear of the vehicle. How many were supposed to be alive?" Yule brought his eyebrows together, actually having to stop and remember before calling out. 5. Why? "Well, there is only 1, Piper called back, his voice thick with both surprise and disgust. "What?" Yule murmured, and stomped his way around to the back of the vehicle. When he poked his head all the way around to look inside of the engine stowage lane, he couldn't help but blink silently in astonishment. The inside of the compartment was covered in bright blood, as if a fight scene from a particularly good Tarantino movie had happened within. The bodies of the other surviving elves were ripped and torn into pieces, their throats ripped all the way open to the meat and sinews that gleamed white in the open air. The only thing living inside of the vehicle was the female elf from before, who sat on the small mound of bodies with a combat knife clutched in both of her hands. Yule turned his head and called out for Domino to bring him the hacky sack before looking back inside of the corridor and walking more into sight. The thing that caught his eye the most was that some of the blood inside had little flecks of gold in it that shimmered in the light, and Yule now stood within full sight of the hatch, both of his hands poised at his sides.
"Stay back!"
The elven woman roared, and Yule squinted a bit as he tried to make out her name tag. "Yethis, huh? Cool name," Yule remarked, and reached up to scratch his head. As he scratched his bare hair, realization slowly dawned on him, but he was able to keep his face in check, remaining cool. "You speak English, do you?" The elf shrank back further into the vehicle, but in her haste clipped the side of her forehead on a compartment doorknob, giving her a short gash which began to bleed steadily. She hissed at the pain and brought her knife up, brandishing it with both hands.
"Stay back! Stay back, you fucking rustblood curse!"
Yule stared at her, eyes narrowed, watching the little trail of blood slowly ooze out from the wound and trail down her temple. Piper gave a hard puff of his cigar, the dried mug root inside crackling merrily, and the rest of the Veil Riders murmured to themselves. Yule stepped forward, resting his right boot on the bottom door as he leaned in, then reached a hand back behind his leg with open fingers. "Mighty curious blood you got there, stranger. One may say you were born under a special moon." The elf brandished the knife at Yule again, waving it a little as if trying to make her point.
"Don't you try and flatter me, rustblood. You step inside here, and I'll gut you like the rest of these useless fuck."
The rest of the words didn't really have the air to formulate, as Domino handed something to Yule around the time she said rustblood. In her efforts to be aggressive and keep her ground, Yethis failed to see the short-barreled pistol-grip shotgun get shoved into Yule's hands. Her words were cut short and off as Yule whipped the shotgun up and fired at once, blowing out her eardrums with the concussion in the small space. Of course, her ears hurt far less than the beanbag that caught her in the middle of the chest. She gasped, the beanbag round bouncing off of her bones and pattering off the wall of the engine compartment. The knife flew from her hands as she was catapulted backwards off of the small mound of dead elves, landing near the cooling beanbag. Her lungs spasmed and heaved as she tried to breathe. She had never felt something like this before in her life, and the pain was like nothing she had ever imagined. Her mouth was agape, and it seemed she could not get any air into her lungs no matter how hard she tried to force them to work. She gasped in panic, which caused her lungs to smart painfully. Then something grabbed onto her combat boot and yanked her hard, pulling her out from her little hidey hole. When she had fallen back, her boots had stayed in view, and Yule was able to reach in and grab them. She felt herself get pulled out of the vehicle unceremoniously, her head bouncing harshly on the bottom half of the hatch door, and Yule just walked backwards while holding her boots. She finally came out onto the firm ground in a bodily thud, and she didn't even have the breath to curl into a ball. Fadithus's eyes rolled as she took in her surroundings. She saw the one who she knew was Yule, having seen his face in all the reports back at the Vale base, and a valley elf she had never seen before standing next to him, wearing her hair in a long braid off of her shoulder. She has that gold-flecked blood, except hers is red and not pink, Yule said, pointing to Fadithus's forehead where she was bleeding. The gift of tongues was able to give her the understanding of their language, as Yethis leaned in towards Yule and said,
She's a half-breed. Half-breed?
Fadithus gasped out, her chest still heaving with pain, and she made to sit up.
Who are you calling half-breed? You valley-eared
The shotgun reported again, and another beanbag slammed into her chest, this time right and high above the breast. Fadithus was thrown back onto the ground, hard, and she screamed silently in pain. The beanbag hung in the air for a beat before bouncing off the bottom of the ASV hatch, finally coming to a rest on the ground after doinking Fadithus on the face. Fadithus laid there, writhing on the ground, as Yule turned and smiled at Domino, who was grinning down at the elf while tapping the ends of his fingers together. I really am glad you brought this stupid thing, Yule said, racking the shotgun again. Domino looked at Yule while never taking the grin from his face.
Less than lethal entertainment at the highest order.
Made getting her out of the vehicle easier, that's for sure. I don't feel like getting stabbed again, Yule said as he handed Domino back his shotgun, then walked over towards the southern elf who was curled up on the ground. He looked inside of the hatch to the four heavily cut up bodies and pressed his lips together disapprovingly. Man, what on earth? Why would she just cut them all up like that? Yule tapped his booted foot a few times while walking around the elf, watching her grimace, eyes closed, and holding her chest with her arms crossed over it. He pulled out a little iron nail from the HQ bunker and kneeled down, touching it to her exposed hand. When nothing happened, he rubbed it on her skin a little harder, and after a few seconds saw that the flesh seemed to flush, but nothing else really came of it. Thought you would start burning like a vampire or something, Yule hummed, before standing back up and flicking the nail down at Fadithus. The nail bounced off of her ear and she hissed angrily, eyes still closed and body curled up. Well, guess we get to try out the little jail they built. Drag her over there, Yule said, then pointed to 10 Vale Riders who had gathered nearby. All of you, keep her hands out of reach of your kit. Check her for anything metal, and take her shoelaces. Make sure some of the other elves are there with you. Don't want you guys getting fey-tranced or something. Down below, Fadithus hissed a painful laugh.
You people really are as stupid as the dirt you came from.
The Vale Riders hauled the southern elf off to the small jail system inside the grain holding center, and Yule waved Yethis over after watching them go. He then fetched his patrol cap and placed it firmly on his head, feeling the small bump of the amulet. Half-breeds, huh? Yethis nodded.
They are known, the coupling of Fae and Elf. They lose a lot of the natural power of their Fae parent, but still gain a lot of the minor powers they can possess, such as transfiguration, long life, the gift of tongues, so on. A few are even still living to this day in our borders, but they mostly stick to themselves as hermits. Powers passed down through the ages in certain families, slowly watered down over time.
Yule stroked his beard in thought, then motioned towards the sliced-up bodies that were being hauled out from the back of the ASV. But why would she cut up all these poor bastards?
Perhaps they had knowledge she wanted to keep. Maybe she needed their blood, maybe they knew something she didn't want getting out. I know, however, that the male there...
Yethis pointed at a male elf whose head was almost sawed completely off, the holes of his airways and other inner workings borne to the air.
...was a secret keeper. He bears the markings of one there on his sleeve.
Yule looked, and just as Yethis described, there were intricate tattoos going up from the wrist of his hand and into his torn sleeve. Yethis continued.
The secret keepers know of the prophecies and the inner workings of the Fae, as well as their old plans. Knowing you could have probably cracked that elf like an egg. But the half-Fae, she will prove to be a far more competent opponent.
Yule frowned and looked up across the base to the horizon, watching the fading light with annoyance. As he stood there with Yethis, he saw small white dots appear along the tree line. The longer he waited, the larger the dots got, and after a while he saw that it was a small flight of Himalaya harpies coming in from a scout run. He looked over at the road and saw that even more Vale folk had shown up from the countryside and cities. At this point, he may have had an entire division under his command if he counted right. He heard the flap of wings beating on the air and turned back around to see the flight was heading right towards him. They landed with a whoosh of air and trotted up to Yule, giving him their report. Yule listened intently before thanking them and sending them on their way to rest. He gave Yethis a short hug, thanked her for her help, and took off at a jog to find his NCOs. He was sweating by the time he found them in the chow hall, and when he burst in through the door, a dwarf drinking by the door leapt from his stool to his feet.
"Attention to the front!"
Everyone sprung up to their feet as Yule panted, and he called out for his NCOs who ran over, some still clutching their three-pronged forks or spoons. Yule took off his hat to try and cool his head, and quietly wished the wintry months would come faster. He looked to his NCOs, then stood back, deciding to address the room as he placed the patrol cap back onto his head. The Himalayas report that the south crawls. They're digging in large artillery pieces near Sanrion, large enough that they will be able to shell anything within a 20-mile radius. Somehow, some way, they've dragged 777s through the Vale, along with self-propelled tracked artillery. We are going on the offensive in a few days in a big way. If we do not go, we all may die here on this hill when they shell us to death. My Vale Riders, I know you are steady to go and ready to kill, but to you auxiliaries, I will give you a choice. If you wish to go, I will take you, but I will not make you. Tomorrow morning there will be a formation. Anyone who is willing to toss in their rifle, show up there at 0800. You'll turn to leave. As you were. I'll see you in the morning. And that's the end of Chapter 12 of the Book 1 Mk.II redo. If you like these stories and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbro's Field Desk. Join us on Discord, join us on X, join us wherever we may be. As well, if you do use ad blockers, and I don't fucking blame you, you can still support the channel via the Ko-fi. We have memberships on Ko-fi, certain tiers that get certain amount of names and benefits on the Discord and yada yada. But the biggest thing is that I get to say your name at the end of the video if you're a member. First up are the first shirts. These guys give the channel $50 per month and hold the channel upon their massive arms like
Atlas in the world.
That would be Marquess Theodoric, Savage, the other Killjoy, Calistrad, Aaron Wilbur, Ware Waffengeist, Imashino, Cody Jarrow, Death Dancer, and Insane Medic. With a particular thanks to Cody Jarrow, Death Dancer, and Insane Medic for all giving over $1,000 so far to the channel. And of course, Insane Medic for being our first shirt. Second is the E4 Mafia. These boys give $25 per month. That's Drew, That One Stady R, Chiba Chigoni, Inquisitor Matt, Hellhound 23, Noxvok, Tab, Dazzlinder, Sonic Arrow, Darkside, Kiwi Bastard, Lacune 8, Lacune, Matty Boy, and Crusader of Florida, who was our first E4 Mafia member. And then there's Snuffy Squad. These guys give $5 per month. That's Moonshot 421, John Doe 4321, Gonkus, Anthony Garcia, Emperor Dipshit, my God, some of these names give me Emperor Dipshit. Miani Coy, Sleepy John, Fafnir 13, Toyin, Loneborough, Martell Martlesby, Sir Martell Martlesby, Noodle, Alan Solano 9. Sounds like Alan Solano. Alan Solano 9. Split Iris Bear. Mika. Damon Bain Plays. Scott Anderson. Where Guard. What is this? Hold on. What does it say? Where Guard Bear Sky Plushie. Okay. Damian McEwen, Supersting 64, Elderock, Croman, Dalek, Jules, Blonde Lord, Thrace Vega, Devin Schonholtz, Andrew Ingill, Yeti Potato, Skelters, Kite Zero, Classic Cthulhu, Diesel Dog, Coffee Commander, Anto, Duncan D, and I'm Delore Smith, our first Snuffy Squad member. And until we see you next time on this side of the veil. That was Franners, our proofreader. That was Technoward. That was Hailey. That was Rue Ryder. And this is Garbro's Field Desk. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.